If someone had told me years ago that a hidden habit would lead me to the darkest place imaginable, I wouldn't have believed them. My name is Eudora, and I grew up in what most would call a faithful Christian home. My parents were devoted believers who ensured that church was a central part of our lives. Sunday mornings were sacred, filled with hymns, Bible stories, and sermons. I could recite verses from memory. And as I grew older, I became active in our youth fellowship. To everyone around me, I was a picture-perfect Christian. But what no one could see was the secret I carried, a secret that began during my teenage years. It started so innocently that I barely recognized the path it would lead me down. Curiosity, something I thought was harmless, became the spark. One day, in a moment of idle distraction, I stumbled into a habit that would grip me for years: masturbation. If you believe in God and near-death experiences, subscribe to Life at NDE today. Discover inspiring messages from God through powerful near-death stories that bring hope and understanding. Hit subscribe now and join us in spreading the light of faith. At first, I dismissed it as nothing serious, a way to deal with the confusion and loneliness that sometimes weighed on me. It was private, hidden, and in my mind, victimless. It felt like a small escape from the pressures of life. I told myself it was normal, something everyone went through, and that it didn't really matter. I was wrong. What began as an occasional indulgence soon spiraled into something I couldn't control. It became my coping mechanism, a crutch I leaned on when life felt overwhelming. Guilt and shame grew inside me like a shadow I couldn't escape. Every time I gave in, I felt a pang of regret, but I quickly pushed it aside. It's not hurting anyone, I would tell myself. God knows I'm human. I can always repent later. I kept my secret buried, pretending everything was fine. I still prayed, read my Bible, and sang in the choir. Outwardly, nothing seemed amiss. But inwardly, I could feel a growing distance between me and God. The more I indulged, the more disconnected I became. My prayers felt hollow, and the warmth I once felt in His presence began to fade. I could hear the sermons on repentance, and every word pierced my heart. But I didn't act. I was trapped in a cycle of self-deception, convincing myself that there would always be time to change. One night, as I knelt to pray, I closed my eyes and felt something shift. At first, I thought I had drifted into a dream, but it felt too vivid, too real. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my room anymore. I was standing at the edge of a vast, dark chasm. The air was thick, and a bone-chilling cold surrounded me. I could hear the faint echoes of screams rising from below, a sound so haunting it made my skin crawl. I looked around, desperate for a way out. But there was nothing, just endless darkness stretching in every direction. Before I could move, a powerful force pulled me forward. It was as if unseen hands had grabbed me, yanking me into the abyss. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void as I spiraled downward. Faster and faster. The descent felt endless, the air growing heavier with each passing moment. I tried to pray, to cry out to God, but no words would come. My heart raced, and a suffocating dread consumed me. I knew where I was headed. I had heard the warnings in church, read the verses about hell, but I never truly believed it could happen to me. After all, I wasn't a bad person. I went to church. I believed in God. How could this be happening? As I fell deeper into the darkness, I began to see faint flickers of light below. But these weren't comforting lights, they were ominous. Fiery glows scattered across a desolate, barren landscape. The screams grew louder, more piercing. As I got closer, the air was thick with the stench of decay, and a suffocating heat enveloped me. I landed with a heavy thud, the impact knocking the breath out of me. When I finally opened my eyes, I wished I hadn't. The scene before me was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. I was in hell. The ground beneath me was cracked and scorched, glowing with embers of fire that seemed to pulse with life. Around me were countless others, their faces twisted in agony as they screamed and writhed in pain. Shadows moved among them, creatures with grotesque forms and eyes that burned with malice. They taunted their victims, tormenting them in ways that were beyond comprehension. I looked down and noticed something I hadn't seen before: chains. Thick, heavy chains wrapped tightly around my body, their metal searing into my flesh. The pain was unbearable, but no matter how hard I struggled, I couldn't break free. The chains seemed to have a life of their own, pulling me toward a deep pit that glowed with an intense, fiery light. I dug my heels into the ground, trying to resist, but it was no use. The realization hit me like a tidal wave: I was here because of my choices. My secret sin. The very habit I had dismissed as harmless had become the chains that bound me. I had been deceived, and now I was paying the price. Tears streamed down my face as I cried out, "Please, God, help me. Save me." But the only response was the mocking laughter of the creatures around me. One of them leaned in close, its cold breath chilling me to the bone. "You belong to us now," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. My mind raced, and panic consumed me. I had always believed in God's mercy, in His forgiveness. But here, in this place, I felt abandoned. Was this really my end? Was there no way out? In the midst of my despair, a single name rose to the forefront of my mind: Jesus. It was faint at first, like a whisper in the chaos. But it grew louder, stronger. "Jesus," I cried out, my voice trembling. "Jesus, save me." I screamed His name again and again, clinging to the hope that somehow He would hear me. The darkness around me seemed to shift, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of something other than despair. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was enough to ignite a spark of hope. I didn't know if it would be enough to save me, but I held on to it with everything I had. And that's when I saw Him. The moment I saw Him, everything around me seemed to pause. The chaotic screams, the suffocating heat, the relentless pull of the chains, all of it dimmed, as though this single presence had power over the very fabric of this dark place. But it wasn't the kind of arrival I expected. Instead of immediate rescue, the reality of my situation deepened. I wasn't being lifted out, I was still chained, still surrounded by torment. The sight of Him wasn't a quick release, but it gave me the smallest thread of hope, a thread I desperately clung to. As I turned my gaze back to my surroundings, I felt the chains tighten. The searing heat of the metal bit into my skin as if mocking the hope I had begun to feel. Around me, the grotesque creatures stirred, sensing my momentary reprieve. Their twisted faces, a blend of malice and mockery, drew closer. One of them sneered, its voice a cold hiss, "You think calling his name will save you now?" The words stung because they echoed my own doubt. I had called out to Jesus, but nothing had changed. I was still bound, still in this place. The chains, the heat, the overwhelming despair, it was all still real. Suddenly, one of the creatures grabbed me with icy, clawed hands. Its touch burned like fire yet froze my very core. It began to laugh, a sound so vile that it made my insides churn. "These chains," it said, its voice like gravel scraping against glass, "they aren't ours. They're yours. Forged by every moment you chose your desires over him." I looked down at the chains, and for the first time, I saw them for what they truly were. Each link glowed with images from my life, moments I had tried to forget, choices I had justified. I saw myself hiding in shame, giving in to temptation again and again, telling myself it didn't matter, that I could stop any time I wanted. The truth was laid bare. I had built these chains with my own hands. Tears welled up in my eyes as the weight of my actions pressed down on me. The creatures around me reveled in my despair, circling like vultures. One of them leaned in close, its breath reeking of decay. "You knew," it whispered, its voice dripping with venom. "You knew the truth. But you chose your flesh. You belong here." The words cut deep because they were true. I had known better. I had heard the sermons, read the scriptures, felt the conviction in my heart. But I had ignored it all, choosing instead to indulge in what felt good in the moment. And now, here I was, reaping the consequences. Suddenly, the chains began to pull again, dragging me toward the pit. I tried to resist, clawing at the scorched ground, but it was useless. The pit loomed closer, a gaping maw of fire and despair. From its depths came a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, a cacophony of screams, wails, and guttural cries that seemed to echo endlessly. I was on the edge now, the heat so intense it felt as though my very soul was being scorched. The chains yanked me forward, and I felt myself slipping. "Jesus!" I screamed, my voice hoarse and broken. "Jesus! Save me!" For a moment, there was silence. The creatures stopped, their mocking laughter frozen mid-sound. The chains seemed to pause, as though something unseen had intervened. I could feel their tension, but they no longer pulled. Then, from the depths of the pit, a figure emerged. At first, I thought it was him, that my cries had been answered. But as the figure grew closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was beautiful, in a way that was almost hypnotic. But there was something wrong, something dark. Its beauty was too perfect, too polished, like a mask hiding something grotesque. The figure smiled, a sly, sinister curve that sent chills down my spine. "Welcome," it said, its voice smooth and silken, "to the reality of your choices." I knew instantly who it was. I didn't need an introduction. This was the deceiver, the one who had whispered lies into my mind for years. Satan. He walked toward me with an air of confidence, his movements fluid and deliberate. "You thought it was harmless," he said, his tone mocking. "A little indulgence, A small secret. But it was never small. Was it? His words felt like daggers, each one piercing deeper than the last. I wanted to argue, to fight back. But I couldn't. He was right. I had believed the lie that my actions didn't matter, that they were insignificant. But now, standing here, I saw the full weight of those choices. Do you know why you're here? He continued, circling me like a predator. Because you listened to me. You followed my whispers. And now, you're mine. I felt a surge of anger and fear. I had been deceived, manipulated into believing that my actions were harmless. But now I could see the truth. I had been a pawn in his game, a soul he had lured away from the light. As he spoke, a glowing book appeared in the air before me. It was ancient and radiant, its golden pages shimmering with an otherworldly light. Satan's expression changed, his smugness replaced with a flicker of irritation. I could tell he didn't want me to see what was inside. The book opened on its own, its pages turning rapidly until they stopped on one with my name. I saw my life laid bare, the moments of my childhood, my youth, and my struggles. I saw the plans God had for me, the ministry I was meant to lead, the lives I was supposed to touch. But as I watched, the words began to fade, replaced by new ones: deceived, destroyed, lost. My heart shattered as I realized what I had forfeited. This wasn't just about my sin, it was about what I had lost because of it. The chains weren't just holding me down, they had stolen my destiny. I fell to my knees, sobbing. "Forgive me," I cried, my voice barely a whisper. I didn't know. I didn't know. The chains tightened again, their fiery heat searing into my flesh. The creatures moved closer, their laughter growing louder. I felt the pull toward the pit resume, stronger than before. But in my despair, I kept crying out, clinging to the only name that could save me. "Jesus," I whispered. "Please, save me." As I knelt there, bound by chains that felt hotter with every passing moment, my cries for Jesus seemed to hang in the thick, oppressive air. The mocking laughter of the creatures surrounded me, their voices echoing in my mind like a twisted symphony of despair. I was being dragged closer to the edge of the pit, the fiery depths roaring beneath me, promising only agony. And then, he spoke. The voice was cold and smooth, a sound that froze me to my core. It wasn't the voice of salvation I had hoped for, it was something far darker. "Eudora," the voice said, drawing my name out like a sneer. "Do you really think your cries can change anything now?" I turned to see him, Satan, standing just a few feet away. His presence was unlike anything I'd ever felt, both mesmerizing and repulsive at the same time. He was beautiful in a way that defied explanation. But his beauty was a lie, a mask that barely concealed the decay underneath. His eyes burned with a sinister light, and his smile was a twisted blend of malice and triumph. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring my fear. "You thought you could hide your secrets," he said, his voice laced with mockery. "You thought you could dabble in sin and still belong to him." He gestured vaguely upward, a smirk playing on his lips. "But look where your choices have brought you." I wanted to speak, to defend myself, but no words came. I could feel the truth of his accusations cutting through me like a blade. He was right. I had hidden my sin, justified it, indulged in it, all while convincing myself it didn't matter. He circled me slowly, his presence suffocating. You told yourself it was harmless, he continued, his tone almost conversational. That it was just a little secret, something you could control. But it wasn't harmless, was it? Every time you gave in, you tightened these chains. Every indulgence brought you closer to me. The chains around me seemed to tighten at his words, their heat searing into my skin. I cried out in pain, but he only laughed. You're mine, Eudora, he said, his voice dripping with triumph. You chose this. You walked away from him, step by step, until there was nothing left to save. His words felt like a hammer, each one driving home the weight of my guilt and despair. I had believed his lies. I had listened to the whispers in my mind that told me my actions didn't matter, that I could repent later. But later had never come. And now, here I was, standing on the brink of eternal torment. As if sensing my thoughts, Satan gestured toward the glowing book that still hovered in the air. Its golden light was the only brightness in this dark, suffocating place, and it seemed to irritate him. Ah, the Book of Destinies, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. Always so dramatic. The book opened on its own, its pages turning rapidly until they stopped on a single page. My name was written at the top, glowing with a soft, golden light. Beneath it, I saw my life laid out in words and images. I saw my childhood, the moments of innocence and joy. I saw the first time I prayed, the first time I felt God's presence. And then I saw the moments where everything began to change, the small compromises, the justifications, the choices that had led me to this place. I saw the plans God had for me, dreams so beautiful they took my breath away. I saw a ministry filled with light, people being healed and restored, lives being touched by the words I was meant to speak. I saw the lives of others intertwined with mine, destinies connected in ways I couldn't have imagined. But as I watched, the images began to fade. The bright, glowing words were replaced by dark, shadowy ones, deceived, destroyed, lost. The light dimmed, and the page began to blacken, as though being consumed by the very darkness around me. No! I screamed, reaching out toward the book as if I could stop it. But it was too late. The light vanished, and the page was empty. Satan laughed, a sound so vile it made me want to cover my ears. Look at what you've lost, he said, his voice filled with mock pity. All because you couldn't resist the whispers. All because you chose your flesh over your faith. I collapsed to the ground, sobbing. The weight of my choices was unbearable. I had lost so much: my purpose, my destiny, the life God had planned for me. And it was all my fault. I had chosen this path, step by step, and now I was standing at its end. The creatures around me closed in, their laughter blending with Satan's, their clawed hands reaching for me. The chains tightened again, pulling me closer to the pit. I could feel the heat rising, the flames licking at my feet. I was about to be consumed, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. But even in the depths of my despair, I couldn't let go of the one name that had always brought me hope. Jesus. I whispered, my voice barely audible. Please, save me. For a moment, nothing happened. The darkness seemed to grow heavier, the heat more intense. But then, I felt a shift in the air. A presence that was unlike anything I had ever known. It was soft at first, like a whisper of wind in a still forest. But it grew stronger, more powerful, until it filled every corner of the darkness. The creatures around me froze, their laughter silenced. Even Satan took a step back, his smug expression faltering. The chains around me began to loosen, their searing heat fading into nothing. And then, I saw him. He stepped forward, his presence radiating light and love that pierced through the darkness like a sword. His face was radiant, his eyes filled with compassion. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a deep, abiding love that made me weep. "Eudora," he said, his voice soft but powerful. "I have come for you." When I saw him, the weight of my chain seemed to dissolve. If only for a moment. Jesus stood before me, his presence unlike anything I could have ever imagined. His light was warm and pure, cutting through the suffocating darkness around me. His face radiated compassion. And his eyes, oh, his eyes looked at me with a love so deep it pierced my soul. There was no condemnation, no anger, only a profound sadness and unshakable grace. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the oppressive heat and chaos of hell seemed to retreat. The creatures around me froze, their grotesque faces contorted with fear. Even Satan, who had mocked me moments before, stepped back, his smugness replaced with a scowl. Jesus spoke, his voice gentle yet filled with authority. "Eudora," he said, calling me by name. "Why are you here?" His question wasn't accusatory. It wasn't filled with blame. It was tender, as though he already knew the answer but wanted me to confront it for myself. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the ground, overwhelmed by the enormity of my guilt. "Lord," I whispered, my voice trembling, "I failed you. I believed the lies. I let my sin control me." Tears streamed down my face as I poured out everything: the shame, the regret, the moments I had chosen my desires over his will. I thought I had time to repent. I cried. I thought I could handle it on my own. But I was wrong. Jesus knelt before me, his hand reaching out to touch my face. His touch was gentle. And in that moment, I felt a warmth unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just the warmth of his light, it was the warmth of his forgiveness, his love, his grace. "Eudora," he said softly, "you were deceived. But I have never stopped loving you." Those words broke something inside me. The chains that had held me so tightly began to fall away, clattering to the ground like dead weight. The marks they had left on my soul remained, but the pain began to fade. I looked up at him, and for the first time, I felt hope. He stood and gestured with his hand. The darkness around us shifted, and suddenly, I was no longer in the fiery pit. Instead, I stood in a vast expanse filled with a radiant light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The air was calm, and a profound peace enveloped me. It wasn't heaven, at least. I didn't think it was, but it was a place far removed from the torment I had just endured. Before us appeared a vision, as if the very air had transformed into a tapestry of living images. I saw the world, busy and bustling with life. People walked the streets, worked, and laughed. completely unaware of the spiritual battle raging around them. "This is what I see every day," Jesus said, his voice tinged with sorrow. "My children, trapped in chains they cannot see." As I watched, the images zoomed in on individuals, people just like me. I saw a young man sitting alone in his room, bound by the invisible chains of addiction. I saw a woman standing in a church choir, her face lifted in worship, but her soul entangled in the grip of hidden sin. I saw pastors, leaders, and believers who looked righteous on the outside but were secretly bound by pride, lust, greed, and other sins they thought they could manage in secret. They believe their sins are harmless. Jesus continued. They think they can serve me while serving their flesh. But no sin is hidden from me. The enemy deceives them, whispers lies into their hearts, just as he did with you. The vision shifted, and I saw something even more heartbreaking. Each person's life was like a book, its pages glowing with golden light. These books held their destinies, the plans God had written for them, the lives they were meant to touch, the purposes they were meant to fulfill. But as I watched, the light in many of the books began to fade. The pages darkened, words disappearing and being replaced with others, deceived, lost, destroyed. I turned to Jesus, my heart heavy with sorrow. "Lord," I said, "what can I do? How can I help them?" His gaze met mine, and in his eyes, I saw a determination that filled me with strength. "Tell them the truth," he said. "Warn them of the enemy's deceptions. Tell them that no sin is too small to matter, that every choice draws them closer to me or closer to destruction. And remind them that I am always here, waiting to forgive, to restore, to set them free." His words carried an urgency that I couldn't ignore. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I will," I promised. "I'll tell them. I'll warn them." The vision faded, and we stood once again in the quiet expanse of light. Jesus turned to me, his face filled with a mixture of love and resolve. "Eudora," he said, "you have been given a second chance. But this is not your home yet. There is still work for you to do." My heart sank as I realized what he was saying. As much as I longed to stay in his presence, to never leave this place of peace and light, I knew I had to go back. "Lord," I whispered,